Hello there. Thank you for joining me here today, whenever you may be watching this. Definitely, we encourage you to attend on Sunday morning at 10 o'clock, and we're going to be continuing our teaching series called Body Shop in just a moment here on the video, but we would love to see you in person 10 o'clock Sunday morning here at Faith Church. If not, we're glad that you're joining us here today. Hopefully you've been able to jump on our website, www.myfaithchurch.org. We've got a number of things that are going on as we're planning as we're launching a lot of fall ministries, things that are occurring there. Hopefully you're taking advantage of some of our free resources, whether that's Right Now Media or instructions regarding the Bible version app or the Bible app. YouVersion is the title of that. Thank you for your contributions, either by clicking that donate button or texting contributions to 73256. Well, if you have been with us for the last few weeks, we've been on a brand new teaching series that we've titled Body Shop. And what we're going to be doing, we're going to be taking a lot of the teachings of Paul, which he expands on from the teaching of Jesus in John chapter 13, where he says, love one another. And in that context, Paul expands in his writings what it means to love one another, right? We looked at be kind to one another last week. We can't be kind to one another in just a human capacity. We all have a limit, right? In order of our kindness, we all reach a point. But yet, what Paul is talking about is kindness that is spirit-enabled. Being kind when you don't feel like being kind. Being kind to the point that it is beyond your human capacity to be kind, right? And that's only possible if you understand and begin to grow in this knowledge of the kindness that has been extended to you and I by the Lord, by Christ. The idea that he has called us while we were yet enemies of him, while we were yet, Romans 5:8, God haters and walking in contradiction to him, and yet he still loved us to send his one and only Son. That is kindness that is extended to us. And the more that we understand that kindness, the more that we will be able to extend that spirit-filled kindness to those who don't deserve it, right? Because we don't deserve God's kindness as well. Well, all this stems from basically this incredible verse that we see in John chapter 13, where Jesus says to his disciples, love one another. And that's our key verse for our entire series here called Body Shop. It's a verse, and let me just read it. A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. The context of this is such an interesting thing in John chapter 13. Really all throughout the Gospels, Jesus makes some very unusual statements at times, doesn't he? Statements that cause you to kind of scratch your head, and I'm sure that was the case for the original hearers. Jesus said things like, "Do not think that I have I've come here to bring peace on the earth. I've come to bring the sword." And you're like, whoa, I thought he was the Prince of Peace, right? And then he continues and he says, I've come to turn a mother or a daughter against her mother and a son against her father. I've come to divide households. And we're like, what? I thought Jesus was a lover of families, right? Well, there's a reason and purpose why Jesus makes those statements. And he's saying that the peace that he brings is going to be controversial. And it's going to split households. And yet it's so powerful that not everybody's going to agree that he is the Prince of Peace. And yet he's the only way. And so we hold on to that, because if we don't, it's going to rob us of our power, right? And so there's reasons and purposes why Jesus makes some of these statements. Like, you can't be my disciple unless you eat of my flesh and drink of my blood, right? I mean, that's another one. And I'm sure people were thinking, what in the world's going on? Well, in the context of our key verse here in John chapter 13, love one another, Jesus makes a couple of interesting, shocking statements or controversial statements. And a couple of those are, if you want to be the greatest, be the least. Now, what in the world does that mean? If you want to be the greatest in my kingdom, learn to be the servant, of all. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. Jesus makes some of these statements here. Now, what does this mean? Well, you look at the context of this. Jesus is gathered with his disciples. It's right before he's going to go to the cross. He is celebrating the Passover meal with them. This is a celebration of a physical deliverance from slavery in Egypt many, many, many thousands of years prior. And yet Jesus is making a statement with his disciples. He's going to be purchasing their spiritual deliverance in just a few short hours, right? And he takes the bread and he takes the cup and he says, "This is my body. This is the covenant of my blood given to you. Whenever you eat and drink of this, you do it in remembrance of me." Well, right before all this, Jesus washes his disciples' feet. And we've looked at this many times, is that the reason why Jesus does this is because there was no servant that was offered to wash his feet and his disciples' feet. It was not an oversight, it was intentional. The persons whose house that was did that intentionally. That was not an oversight. And so there's this tension in the room. And all of Jesus' disciples understood that there was a kingdom that Jesus was going to usher in. And yet they always thought incorrectly in regard to that kingdom. They believed it was going to be an earthly kingdom and he was going to establish his government. And they believed that they wanted to be in positions of power. And so no one was willing to take the servant role. And so Jesus' feet remained unwashed. They were thinking still earthly kingdom, weren't they? All the other kingdoms of the world are advanced by the sword or advanced by the golden rule. Whoever has the gold makes the rule, right? And so this is what they were used to. This is the Roman Empire, is the context. They wanted peace on earth, and so they carried the biggest stick, right? And before them it was the Greeks, and before them it was the Medes and the Persians, and the Babylonians, and then the Assyrians, and then the Syrians, and before that the Egyptians. And every single kingdom, to advance their ideas, to advance their agenda, would use power, would use the sword, would use wealth or money. And so you needed to make sure that you were in the right position. And this is what Jesus' disciples were thinking as they entered into that place. Because where you sat in connection with the host, and that would have been Jesus, orchestrating the Passover meal, would have determined your place of importance, right? And so no one is going to take the servant role. And in the context of this is when Jesus says, if you want to be greatest in my kingdom, you need to be the least. You need to be the servant of all, because my kingdom is not going to be advanced the way these other kingdoms have been advanced. We're going to change the world through what I'm showing you here, through being a servant, by taking the towel and washing people's feet. And so if you want to be the greatest in my kingdom, be the least, right? Learn to be the servant of all. It was an upside down kingdom type of mentality. And it was a spiritual revolution that occurred 200, 300 years after Jesus' resurrection. The world was transformed and no one ever picked up a sword. And it wasn't because they had the most gold. It was a spiritual revolution of the heart, right? And this is how Jesus and his disciples today changes the world. And in the context of this is our key verse, right? It's our series verse. Jesus says, "As I have loved you, love one another, so you must love one another. By this, all men will know that you're my disciples." It's not because of your position of power. It's not because you have the most gold. It's not because, of all these other kingdoms examples. It's about the example that Jesus has set for his disciples. Well, last week we looked at this one another command that Paul expands on from Jesus' command here in John chapter 13. He said, be kind to one another. Well, this week we're going to jump into Galatians chapter 2. If you're familiar at all about the book of Galatians, Paul is taking 5 chapters prior to this to talk about a burden that only Jesus can bear, a sin burden. And he's writing really in response to some disturbing news that he's been hearing, that that people who have come into a relationship with Christ, they are starting to fall into some teaching, into some belief that it's not enough just to believe that it's grace and grace alone, what Jesus has done and in terms of salvation, but there are other things that you need to do. And one of those things was to be circumcised. I know that's a little weird, right? I know, but in that context, that was a big question. And Paul's writing, he's saying this, you are picking up a burden that Jesus has already bore for you. And he talks about freedom, and he talks about Jesus is picking up this sin burden. And we need to understand when we try to add things to the gospel, we're picking up a burden that is not ours to bear. And in the context of these 5 chapters, he begins the 6th chapter with this, and this is our key verse: bear one another's burdens. Bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Now let me read it to you in context, just the first 5 verses of chapter 6 here. Brethren, if a man is overtaken in any trespass, you who are spiritual must restore them. Such one in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself, lest that you also be tempted. I mean, Paul is basically saying, if a person who is in sin, you who are spiritual, in the spirit, with gentleness and respect, restore that person, confront them on that issue, considering yourself as well. Pay attention to yourself, lest you will be tempted. And then in verse 2 he says, bear one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. For if he thinks, or if anyone thinks himself to be something, when he is nothing, he deceives himself. But let each person examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself and not in another. For each one shall bear his own load. Now, if there's a key thought to this whole passage of Scripture as we're going to look at bearing one another's burdens, it is this. If I'm to bear one another's burdens, or to others' burdens, and if I'm to allow other people as well to help me bear the burdens that occur in my life, I better first allow God to bear mine. These 5 chapters that Paul is writing to these Galatian believers in this area, he's convincing them that there is a burden that they cannot bear. Only God can bear. And so if we are to obey this one another command of bear one another's burdens, the prerequisite is this. You first have to allow God to bear yours. Now, this is a spiritual burden, obviously, that Paul is talking about. And yet there's these earthly burdens that we're all required to bear as well and help one another bear. And the earthly burdens are financial burdens or relational burdens or health burdens, difficulties in life, right? And you can mishandle these burdens. And the way that you can mishandle these burdens is that first, you don't allow God to bear your sin burden. I oftentimes think about some of the things that I have seen people bear over the years. And there's been so many occasions when people have gone through a difficulty, and I hear them say, I could have never gotten through this past 6 months or this past year if it wasn't for the Lord. If it wasn't for the Lord, there is no way I could possibly get through this. Oh, and that is such a true statement. So I just want to give you a few things here today as we're going to go rather quickly here in this video. I don't want these to be as long as they usually are, but here's just a few truths when it comes to bearing these burdens from the scripture that we just saw. Here's the first one. There are some burdens that only God can bear, right? And again, we look at this very first verse here in chapter 6. Brethren, if a man is overtaken by any trespass, you who are spiritual, restore that person in a spirit of gentleness, and yet consider yourself, because you might be tempted as well, right? See, all earthly burdens have a spiritual element, don't they? If we don't handle our earthly burdens well, we can fall into bitterness, anger, resentment, And even if we handle this burden well, that can develop a lack of compassion for other people. It can cause pride issues and image issues, fear that perhaps one day there will be a burden that in your own capacity you can't handle, and so you protect it. Oh, there's all kinds of unhealthy ways that you can try to handle a burden, right? And so Paul is talking about here is that if you don't get the spiritual burden first out of the way, there's no way possible that you're going to handle correctly the earthly burdens that come in our lives. If you don't understand that Jesus is the only one who can handle the sin burden, there will be a mishandling of the earthly burdens. You'll fall into despair, you'll fall into depression, you'll fall into a lack of compassion. There'll be pride issues. You can fall and default into a substance to try to help you get through that burden. If God is not the one that we allow to handle our burden, we will mishandle the other burdens in life. It's very interesting, this verse talks about burdens, but it's really, you could also translate this word load. There's a load that we cannot bear. And it is a word actually that is really about more for a load that only a pack animal, like a camel or something like that in the context here, or a donkey would be able to load. A load that was not meant for a human to bear. And when we try to take those burdens on, we mishandle those. When it comes to loads, there's been a couple of times in my life when I've mishandled payloads. There was an occasion, this is a few years ago, and I was trying to load something up in the back of my pickup truck. I was trying to drive a riding lawnmower up some ramps and load it. And it was fairly steep. And so I decided, Dad of the Year award here, to recruit my 10-year-old, or 11, he was pretty young at that time, Cameron, to help me, because my thought was this: I'm probably too heavy to sit on this lawnmower and it's to go up this steep angle. So why don't I get my son to do it, and I'll push from behind. And it wasn't a good idea, right? We get about halfway up and Cameron starts to get nervous and he starts yelling back to me as I'm trying to push, and the riding mower is not going anywhere up this steep incline, right? Dad, I'm getting nervous. Dad, I'm getting nervous. I'm not comfortable. And then finally he just kind of bails out and does the tuck and roll, right? And the lawnmower starts to come back on the ramps. I try to hold it as best I possibly can, but eventually I'm like, I have to let this thing go, and it rolls back and it hits the corner of the house. It was just a wonderful Dad of the Year moment and a mishandling, of a load, right? Now, since then, I've learned how to do that a little differently. I go, into a ditch, and I'll make the angle so steep, and I'm able just to kind of, do that. Well, the loads that we're called to handle in our life, right? If God isn't the one that we allow to handle the sin load, then we're going to mishandle the other loads as well. We're not going to handle the stress correctly. We're going to default to a behavior. We're going to become critical. We're going to fall into despair, right? The loads that we are called to bear, the burdens that we are called to bear, is not just the sin load. That is where it starts. But when we get that sin load, right, and Paul says, be careful, because we all can fall into this temptation of mishandling our burdens or mishandling the load that we're called to bear, right? And if we're not careful, we'll fall into that same temptation as someone that we're perhaps trying to come to get to an understanding that they need to give that burden, to the Lord. And so there is a load that ultimately the Lord can only bear. And that allows us to handle these earthly burdens or these earthly loads in a way that is godly. God can handle them all, right? And we can either mishandle them and try to bear them ourselves, or we can give them to the one who is able to bear all the burdens of life, right? And so this is the way Paul is talking about. He's starting here in verse 1. Brethren, there's a load you can't bear. And so if someone falls into a sin and there's an area of their life that they're just not giving over to the Lord, and they think that Perhaps the Lord is going to help them bear this load, and there's a part of their life that is out of order. Boy, you need to tell them they need to get that part of their life straight. They need to surrender that to the Lord, because that will allow them to mishandle all these other loads, burdens that life will throw at us. Be careful, because you can fall into that same trap, right? Well, here's our second truth when it comes to this. There are also some burdens or some loads that we're called to bear, together. Paul starts in verse 2. He says, bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Now, this isn't a sin burden that Paul's talking about here. That's verse 1. But he's talking about the burdens of life, whether those are relational burdens or financial burdens or health burdens or whatever it may be, difficulties in life. You need to help one another bear one another's burdens. So interesting here. It doesn't say you help other people bear their burdens. It says bear each other's burdens. You see, oftentimes we're really good at looking at other people and saying, you know what, I think I need to come around that person and help them in that particular issue. But when it comes to our burdens, it's very easy to hold on to our pride and not ask for help. And so this command is really this: bear one another's, each other's burdens. And the key word here, I think, is humility, because it's so easy to say, I'll help someone else. But yet there's always these things in our life where we're reluctant to ask, aren't we? To bear one another's burdens. And then verse 3 says this: for if anyone thinks himself to be something, if you think you have this thing under control and all you need is yourself and God, no, that's not what the scripture says. Because all of us at times are going to need to require the asking to help bear one another's burdens. A great example of this is found in the book of Exodus, where two guys by the name of Aaron and Hur, not H-E-R, but H-U-R, are alongside Moses. And I was going to give you the context of this. The Amalekites came. This is right after God delivered his people from Egypt, and they crossed the Red Sea, and they basically plundered Egypt for 400 years of payback, for slavery. The Lord allowed the Egyptians to be favorably disposed toward the Israelites. And so they gave them their gold and their wealth, and the Israelites didn't even have to lift a sword. And so the Amalekites, they see this and they think, oh, they're easy pickings. And so they actually go to the end where, as they were traveling, the old and the sick and the lame, and they attack from behind, which was really against the rules of warfare and conduct at the time. And so God says, we're going to teach these Amalekites a lesson. And so Moses instructed Joshua, you're going to meet the Amalekites in battle. But there's going to be something I need you to understand here, Moses. They're going to be fighting in the battle, Joshua and the Israelites. And they had never fought before. They were a slave nation. They weren't trained. And they're going out against the hardened and battle-crusted, Amalekites. And so God says to Moses, as long as you keep your hands raised on the hill, the battle that is raging in the valley will go in the favor of God's people. But as soon as you let your hands down, the Amalekites will start to win. So Moses goes up on the hill, and guess what? His arms get tired and his arms get heavy. He's bearing a load of his own weight, right? And his hands go down. And then guess what happens? In the valley, they start to lose the battle. And so Aaron and Hur, they come up and they hold Moses' hands in the air, and Joshua in the valley defeats them. And there's something so interesting at the end of this. Verse 14 in chapter 17 of the book of Exodus, the Lord said to Moses, write this down for a memorial in the book and recount it in the hearing of Joshua. Joshua needs to hear what happened on the hill, because the battle, yes, is fought in the valley, but the victory was on the hill. And boy, there's a lot of symbolism in terms of our own struggles. The victory was won on the hill, wasn't it, right? And here we have an Old Testament illustration of this. So write this down for Joshua, because he's just used to what's going on in the valley. He's fighting. He's doing the part in the role that God has taught him to do. He's swinging the sword alongside his fellow brothers, but he needs to understand what happens and occurs here on the hill. And so write this down, and I will utterly blot out the remembrance of Amalek, the Amalekites, from under heaven. And Moses built an altar there and called it its name, "The Lord is my banner." There's such a great illustration, isn't it, for what it means to bear one another's burdens. You see, the battle is fought in the valley, but the victory is always on the hill. We see that Moses is sitting on a rock. If we would read the scripture, there's a foundation there. We see that Moses lifted his own hands because it wasn't responsibility of Aaron or Hur to lift Moses' hands. It was their responsibility to come alongside him. And we see we have this great illustration of what it means to come alongside one another and help, lifting our hands to the ultimate burden bearer, the one who is able to secure victory in the valley, because the battle is being fought in the valley, but also the victory is won on the hill. You know, when it comes to prayer, for example, there are times, especially like on Friday morning, I usually go into the worship center on Friday morning, and I'll sit where I normally sit, and in my mind I can visualize people that, even though we don't have assigned seating, you know this, everybody usually tends to sit sort of close in the same area. And so in my mind I'm thinking of all these people, you know, that sit in these various spots, and I just start to pray for them, most of the time by name, right? And as much as I can remember who is sitting where, right? But I also found that it's so easy to get distracted as I'm sitting there by myself, sitting in this hard chair, right? And I'm thinking, kind of squirming, you know, and I start praying, and then I look up and there's papers up there on the music stand. Let me go arrange those, right? And I go back down, I sit down, I start praying again, and then I think, you know, on the piano there, Tammy usually has some kind of chocolate or something there, or a, you know, cough drop or something. So I go up there and I take it, right? And I'll sit back down, and then I'll look around and I see a Kleenex on the floor or a bulletin or whatever, and then I just get distracted, and then I think, well, maybe I'll just go to the back of the room and I'll sit on one of the couches. Oh, that's horrible, because in 10 minutes I'm starting to nod off, you know. But you know, whenever I meet with the elders, and we meet once a month and we pray, I never do that. There's just something about praying with one another, or when I'm praying with someone over the phone, or praying, you know, in a smaller setting with a group of people, whatever it may be. There's just something about it, about lifting our hands to the ultimate one who can bear all of our burdens. Yes, we're called to fight in the valley, yes, but the battle is won on the hill. And there's something about other people lifting up, you know, our hands, and us as well, lifting up their hands to the Lord. Well, here's number 3. Number 3 is this. You know, there are some burdens that we are also called to bear ourselves. So interesting. Paul talks about there's a burden that only God can bear. And be careful, because, you know, other people who are not allowing God to have control of their burden, you might fall into that same temptation. And then he says, bear each other's burdens. So there's a burden that only God can bear, and there's also burdens that we're required to come alongside of others, and others to come alongside for us. But then there is this verse 4 here, where it says, let each one examine his own work, and then he will have rejoicing in himself alone, not in another. And so we're talking just about the individual here. And then verse 5 says this, for each one shall bear his own load. There's a burden that you are required to bear by yourself, but it's a different word. In our English, we just translate it, you know, load or burden. And it's the same word that is used in the beginning verses here in chapter 6 of Galatians. But here in verse 5, it's a different word, but it's translated the same. Well, the one word in the earlier verses is a load that we're not required to bear or can't bear. It's a pack animal. It's a load that you put on a donkey or on a camel. That's a burden. But here in verse 5, it's a different word that is used. It's more about a backpack that a person or a sack that a person would put on their back. So there is a load or a burden that we are required to bear ourselves. What is Paul meaning here? Well, there are burdens that we will face in life that we have to give to the Lord ultimately, right? There's the sin burden. There are burdens that people come alongside of us. But there are also burdens that we are required to carry by ourselves, struggles. Things that the Lord allows us to wrestle with. And we give them to the Lord as well. And in the midst of the wrestling, in the midst of the struggle, in the midst of bearing that burden, there is a strengthening that occurs. There's a great illustration about a butterfly that, when they're emerging from the cocoon, you're so tempted, if you've ever seen this, right? Seen a butterfly try to emerge. There is a struggle that is there. And if you kind of peel the chrysalis off, the cocoon off of a butterfly, the butterfly cannot fly. And the reason is because that struggle is necessary in order to strengthen the wings. And even though it's painful to watch, you kind of want to help the animal, help the butterfly. The struggle is what makes flight possible. And in the same way, there are various burdens, and God knows our limitations. He's not going to give us a burden beyond what we can bear, right? We know that verse. But yet that struggle strengthens us. And you've heard people say that, when it comes to some struggles or burdens that, the Lord has allowed them to come through, they may not say they want to go through the circumstance again, but they can also say, I've heard people say this so many times, I certainly have learned a whole lot more about the Lord. I've certainly learned how to trust a whole lot more. I've certainly learned the discipline of prayer a whole lot more. I certainly have a lot more faith than I did before I went through this burden or struggle. We may not appreciate the instance or the circumstance, but the evidence of the growth and the strengthening is there. Well, here's our takeaway. It's pretty simple. It's this. Put this into practice. If there's an area of your life that is out of whack with the Lord's will, you're mishandling a burden. And you need to give that burden over to the Lord and ask for his forgiveness. And then also, he's going to give you strength to handle it and not mishandle the burdens in life. When it comes to a burden that we're trying to handle by ourselves, the Lord will bring about people into our lives, but we need to ask. There are times we're going to help others, and there's also times that others are going to help us. We need to be humble enough to ask and sensitive enough to know when to ask if others need help. And there's also struggles that God calls us and burdens to bear, right? And understand the Lord is going to help you bear those burdens, whether it's a financial burden, a relational burden, or health burden, or difficulty, or struggle, whatever it may be. The Lord will not give you a burden beyond what you can bear. And it's in the bearing of that burden, when you do it with the Lord and you don't mishandle those burdens, and yet you give that to the Lord and you handle it with honor and integrity and with purpose, right? That there is a strengthening that occurs. Well, the Lord bless you and the Lord keep you. May his face shine upon you and give you strength. Amen.